Hi, and welcome to our first instalment of our client spotlights. Today, I am at Director General's house in Southampton, and I am with Professor Tim Higgenbottam. So, Tim, could you just introduce yourself and tell us who you are?
Tim Higgenbottam. I've done a wide variety of jobs, but I started as a physician and I was employed by a small hospital outside Cambridge called Papworth Hospital. And I was employed there as a physiologist as well as a physician. And I looked after a very large physiology laboratory, which was unusual at that time. So I had an opportunity to study people as well as look after them. But the looking after bit was also there in a sort of extraordinarily challenging way because it was a hospital that had started doing heart transplantation, heart-lung transplantation that came along. And when my colleague John Walwick was employed, he joined just after I did. And so we started heart-lung transplantation and undertook a lot of investigations as to how to do it. He had been trained to do the surgery in Stanford in California and brought back those skills. And what we had to add to that was the skills in looking after patients before and after transplantation. And it was there that I think a lot of the work I'd done when I was in training came to the fore. I'd done a lot of lung physiology, some of it quite bizarre, but that all contributed to the activities that we could do in Papworth. And it led actually to developing a device that we're now trying to develop, or let's say extend the capabilities of what we had before. And I'll just tell you a little bit about the story towards that. And that it started with a range of patients with different lung diseases who are dying with their disease. And one of the illnesses was a terrible disease called primary pulmonary hypertension. And people would get this in the late 20s. And we had a patient with primary pulmonary hypertension in the hospital, and she had terrible illness. She had angina when she rolled in the bed and was blue. And so we treated her by infusing prostacyclin with a little pump into her subclavian vein. And that turned her from blue to pink. And she got out of bed and she walked about. And she was then discharged home after 6 days. And she was the first person we treated. And I was very keen that we did not treat anybody else until we knew this would work. So we treated her for a year and then published it in The Lancet as a single case, saying this was magic. She went home and looked after her daughter. She started work again, and she came for lung transplantation 3.5 years later because the disease had continued to deteriorate. It was not a drug, the prostacyclin, to reverse the disease, but it helped people for a period of time. Nothing else had done that, though. So we actually started treating a lot of people with prostacyclin. And I, at the same time, was working on inhaled nitric oxide. And we started using nitric oxide to do the same, vasodilate the lungs, and used that as a test to see whether it'd be helped by prostacyclin. And that sort of became the standard test. We didn't realize that it would, but that's how it came about. And nitric oxide was also then developed for treating neonates with pulmonary hypertension. And we introduced a method for delivering both the prostacyclin and the nitric oxide. And the nitric oxide was delivered as a pulse because we knew that when the nitric oxide goes in, it binds immediately with hemoglobin. So none of it comes out. And you don't want nitric oxide in the environment around people for a whole range of reasons, but it isn't a gas that you need to have around you. So by pulsing it, it meant it became quite safe to do it. And that became a standard treatment for neonatal disease. But it also taught me about delivering the pulse of gas right at the beginning of the breath. And this is a trick because that first bit of air that goes into the lung travels down the best airways and to the normal bits of the alveoli in the lungs. So when I'm sat here, that's all going to the bases of my lungs. If I was standing on my head, it'd be going to the apices of my lungs. But anyway, the detail is that it was a sign that we could deliver to that site because we were getting this enormous effect in vasodilation of the lung. And in primary pulmonary hypertension and in neonatal pulmonary hypertension. Not all the blood vessels have got blood flowing, but only those that were getting the nitric oxide, and that dramatically improved their cardiac output. So that's how I started. And we did move on with our various treatments. And I have to tell you one that we introduced, and that was Viagra, because it works on the same enzyme system that nitric oxide does. And it was as good as nitric oxide. And it was a pill. And the first person I treated with that was a person from Iceland, because I couldn't treat them with prostacyclin because they wouldn't accept it in Iceland as a therapeutic. So he got Viagra, and that became probably the most commonly used vasodilator treatment for this illness. And it's interesting, I was talking to some people yesterday about our other device that we're now developing, but he said his sister was being treated with Viagra still, and that's with all the other new treatments that followed it. But anyway, that was a long time ago. But anyway, the point about the ideas that came out of the work there, they sort of distilled themselves when we were facing COVID, because it was quite clear that people who had severe pneumonia were dying more commonly than they were before COVID. And it's a question of why should that be? And part of the problem was it was intensive work looking after people who were in respiratory failure and critical care units. And to be honest, there were so many people going into hospital that they couldn't be managed in the standard units. They were being put into medical wards where the nursing levels are not as good as in the others. And this sort of spread led to a lot of machines being developed for this use, one of which was CPAP for treating people who snore, high flow oxygen, blowing at very, very high flow rates, and non-invasive ventilation with a mask. So you didn't have to be ventilated with a tube down your throat. Now, none of those worked. And what we found in the results from studies from around the world, involving something like 10,000 patients altogether, CPAP, high flow oxygen, and non-invasive ventilation did not prevent higher levels of death rates. The death rates went up from 30 to 45% during COVID around the world. And the other thing is they didn't stop people going on to mechanical ventilation. So they didn't work. So why should it not work? And why didn't oxygen work? And it goes back to a very simple explanation. And it was that flowing oxygen to people, normally from a wall supply or from a cylinder, is controlled by a rotameter, which you can make the bobbin go up and down. And the maximum it can go to accurately is 15 litres per minute. But a very clever guy, not me, but a very clever guy, measured the inspiratory flow rate of these patients with COVID, and he discovered that the flow rates were as high as 40 litres per minute. So you can imagine receiving oxygen flowing at 15 litres per minute, individual at 40 litres per minute was drawing in room air to 25% of the air going into his lung, diluting the amount of oxygen that was getting into the bits that needed to be taken up to keep the oxygen level right. So that was the failing of it, and it's nobody's fault. It's just simply we've outgrown in knowledge using just simply a rotameter that's limited to 15 litres per minute. I could say actually it's just as bad when you're at home with oxygen, because there it's limited to 5 litres per minute. And when you go out walking, your breathing goes up to 30 litres per minute. So again, it's not surprising that in America, for example, they spend $3.8 billion a year for oxygen at home. And people don't use it because they don't get any value from it. They can't walk to the shops and things of that sort. They can only use it when they're sitting down. So all of these things weighed heavily on us because we couldn't see why this couldn't be changed. And partly thinking about pulsing the nitric oxide, we thought, well, why don't we pulse oxygen? And then some wonderful work that Lai did showed that the flow rate needs to go up and be matched. You have to match the flow rate of the gas to the patient's inspiratory flow. So that set us a challenge. How do we measure the inspiratory flow and deliver the oxygen to their mouths? And that's what we've been trying to solve for the last year and a half, effectively. And we think we've got the answer to it. And we started to work with people who have little miniature devices that can be fitted just in front of the mouth of the patient and record the flow rate or something that's close to it, which I won't tell you about. And that then tells the robot what flow rate it has to deliver in. We have a mass flow controller in it, which can go up to 200 liters per minute. And that is told what to do in terms of the flow rate. And the duration is determined by an oximeter. And the piece of work that we're doing at the moment is to develop the oximeter to be agnostic of skin tone. Because if you have a dark skin, when you shine light on it, it absorbs the light, and therefore the reflected light coming out is diminished substantially, and to a third of what comes out when it's going into a relatively non-toned skin. And this has a profound effect upon the oximeter and causes it to have a very, very high overreading of what it's seeing. Essentially, is 40% overread. So we're working hard on an algorithm that will correct for that by measuring it just at the beginning of putting the watch-style oximeter on the wrist, and that will adjust the measurements to fit in with the skin tone. So that's where we are.
I also want to kind of talk about the workstation,
Sure.
as in, how did you choose? Because you've got a full virtual office suite with us. You get your mail scanned
Sure.
to you. I just wanted to know sort of what someone like you in your profession, like what exactly did you need it for, and why did you feel that you have something like that?
Well, the starting point is to register yourself as a company, you need an address. And the point is that our company has people scattered all over England who are on our team, or in our board, if you want to call it that. Some are in London, some are not too far from here, and others are quite a long way away. So we couldn't really have a place that was in an easy reach for everybody. So what we decided is that we would go where the majority of people were, which was in the south of England. And Southampton's actually very well connected. And here is actually very connected because we're, probably about 15 minutes from the railway station, and probably similar to the airport. And you've got the M3. So it's extraordinarily easy to get people about. So that's part of the reason for doing it. And as we've started working seriously on the design part, there are a lot of people around this part of the world that do stuff. And we have people just outside Salisbury who are developing for us the oximeter that'll be a wristwatch one. And that determines how long the flow goes on, and therefore the dose of oxygen they get for each puff of gas. And they're doing that, and they're developing at the same time the ability to be agnostic of your skin tone, because it was found during COVID that people who had dark skin could have a 40% overread of the oxygen content of the blood. And that meant they were not being given enough oxygen. And that's terrible. And that possibly accounts for the higher mortality rate with people who had dark skin tone. So there's been an enormous effort to try to correct this, and a lot of manufacturers are doing it, but we have our own particular way of doing that. And we'll have those devices probably able to control the opening time of our flow meter, and that'll give us the dose. And it'll be agnostic. We'll test people's skin tone before they go on the oximeter, and then adjust the results that we get from the oximeter, it's called. We'll adjust that to correct for the error induced by the absorption of light when you shine it on your skin. How about that?
Yeah, how about that?
But that's a company that's very close by here. And the other group that we're beginning to work with is in Guildford, and they're helping us with the sensors for measuring the flow. So you can see how originally we started our work in Cambridge, and still we developed the device there. We have some links with Sheffield University, with Papworth Hospital, or the Royal Papworth, I should call it now, because it's moved into Cambridge. And we have the opportunity of having an office that we can use. We haven't used it very much because we've been terribly busy going around the country doing this stuff. But that's been very helpful. And it gave us a place where we could register the company. And in addition to that, the HMRC requires us to do our operation from a registered address. And we get our mail as well.
I use the facilities here at...
Yes, we do. We use it at the starting point of our company. We haven't come back yet, mainly because it's very difficult. We have people who do lots of other things as well. So their travel time is their burden, if you like. So they have to keep it down. But we will use it much more now that we're getting very close to this finishing point of the long development.
Would you be able to share any milestones or breakthroughs that you've had within your journey?
Well, technically, we started at the end of 2022. So our starting point basically was using what we had developed as a device to measure people's breathing and also deliver a particular flow rate that was needed to deliver the gas out. At that point, that was our first understanding of how to do it. And then we've had a series of learnings. The main one was, how do we study people who need oxygen? And it wasn't an easy thing to think about because the only place very often would be in an intensive care unit. We wouldn't be welcomed in an intensive care unit. A gang of people in a funny machine and things of that sort. So we had to think of something else. And the main thing was exercise. And so we moved to doing exercise actually at the beginning of this year. I bought the static exercise bikes and we started putting ourselves onto the exercise bikes. So that was a landmark. And I'd say that probably was a learning that we came up with in June of this year. And then we did our first volunteer study for 3 weeks ago. And we've only just finished analyzing all the breathing patterns on that. They're all collected. And on an exercise that has many steps of different levels of work, you can generate over 6,000 breaths to analyze. And because I'm a physiologist, I have to see every one. And it's a real trial getting it off to show me all the different breathing patterns, because even when you've got an oxygen demand there's lots of interruptions. And that's very important as to how we design the algorithm that controls the device to ignore those abnormalities and to set limits for it. So if you like, the artistry of this is me, but the skill set is in the people who write the software. And they need to know exactly how to select the right breaths. And that's really challenging. And what we've come up with now is the idea that we have to actually have the sensor facing as you breathe in, because it's the flow in that enables the sensor to pick the flow rate in. We're not interested in expiration, just in inspiration. So this is extraordinarily important. And there isn't a great deal of pressure change. So we've had to, and this has come out of our exercise study, it's got to be an extraordinary sensitive system. I can't tell you what it is, or the two that we've chosen, but they are designed to do exactly this. So that was the other milestone. And that was yesterday we decided on that. So in 3 months' time, the machines will be built for us, and then we'll put it all together and do the exercise studies again.
Got a lot of work ahead of you.
Well, the exercise studies are straightforward. It's the analysis of the data that's the important thing, but also the correction and the competence of the algorithm. If they're not, then the whole thing fails. So, we've got a long journey still. But in fact, I can now see the possibility of being able to have a video of this working. And I think you asked me to bring a machine along, but at the moment it's about this big. And I can't bring that along. But probably by the summertime, it'll be in a small thing, which is about 2 cigar boxes.
So a question I've got is, what are the next steps in bringing your technology to a wider audience? So I guess let's touch upon, how are you kind of marketing this at the moment? Who do you want to kind of try your product or buy it?
Well, we are a startup company. We have the money for the prototype building. So We have quite enough money for that aspect. But we then have to build a machine that has to be oxygen clean, by which I mean it has to be built in an environment where there is no dust. No danger, therefore, of dust getting into the machine to cause explosions. Okay? And oxygen clean is the key element to the building of the machine. So to undertake that piece of work, which actually will be the device that will be designed to go onto the market. The size I mentioned earlier goes from a big box down to 2 cigar boxes size. And the industrial design for that is quite complex because it has to be mass produced ultimately. Although for our proof of concept study in people who are unwell with lung disease, who we will ask to undertake exercise and hopefully demonstrate with our device that we can get them to exercise more. Some years ago, with one of my students at Sheffield, she did her MSc in medicine technology, and she did a study for us using our nitric oxide delivery device to deliver puffs of oxygen. And she found that people with COPD could walk further and significantly walk further, having a pulse of oxygen given to them. And the dose was extraordinary. It went from 60 to 120, and that was the step that gave rise to this increased walking distance. And that was pulsing it without matching the flow rate. So we have an idea that study needs to be repeated as our test model is showing that it works in lung disease. And that study will cost an enormous amount of money. So we have to start working with angel investors, and perhaps one big angel investor. And what they're looking for is us to demonstrate that the robot is working. And all the things that I've said about what it has to do, they have to see that. And my imagining is that we'll do that probably with an athlete on a bike, getting up to very, very high inspiratory flow rates and then down to very low ones, and showing the capacity of the device to pulse every breath with oxygen. And that particular study we need to do probably before May. And that means having a video probably of the athlete doing that. And I think that will be sufficient to start people thinking about what the capability is of the device, particularly as even when you're very fit, your oxygen saturation can start to slip, and our device will sense that and give you a little puff of oxygen, you see. So it's quite interesting. So that will be, I hope, there is no reason why we should not be able to do that by June.
Not that far off.
And then that is the first step towards raising the money to do the study. And we're very keen to launch this in America. And the reason for that is that they have a particular way of looking at devices, which if they see inside them the same mechanics that have been put into other devices, it becomes very much easier to have them approved. And what we will then do is to do a standard randomized controlled study to demonstrate in COPD people that we can get them to walk further. Incidentally, none of the machines that were used during COVID to help people breathe, none of those improved COPD walking distance. And that's just to give you a sort of angle that you can apply the information to something that then has an outcome of a larger number of people not being aided by the oxygen delivery. That's how I think we can convince people that it'll work. And then the FDA will see, we will have most of our major components will have been in other devices that they've seen. And then it's just the design of the clinical program to demonstrate that it does indeed improve exercise tolerance in these patients. So that would give us what is called a 5K advanced approval for marketing. And that's very important because you can't do that in Europe. You can't do it in the UK, except with a great deal of extra work. And we think that'll probably get us to a point that other investors will start to be interested in us.
So the last question is, what advice would you give to other technology-focused startups looking to make a significant impact in healthcare? So I think everyone sort of in business or in startups, they have a struggle, don't they? And they obviously need to overcome it. So I
Yeah.
guess talk about,
Mm.
was there anything that you struggled with when you were starting up and
Mm.
how you overcame it?
Well, the thing was a complete surprise. I have not run a company before. I've been a senior officer of companies, but I've never run my own company. So that's been a challenge. But the reality is that as a result of COVID worldwide, the amount of money that's available for early projects has just dropped enormously, 40% globally. That's what investors, the investment has gone. There's lots of ways of getting small amounts of money, but to build this prototype, it's taken a particularly, for ordinary big companies, nothing. But for us, as a group of individuals, whatever, we had to find that money ourselves. So we've paid for the prototype building. That's been not excessively expensive, but the study after that, the COPD study and the work that goes into putting it in for a submission with all the manufacturing details, that's extraordinarily expensive. And I would say that's a lot for people to get. And it requires really to have an edge on anything else. And we think we've got that with this device because it's been a long time coming. We still don't know whether it will work. But if it does work, then I think it would be quite unusual. And it has to be a robot. It's got to have the ability to lessen the workload of staff looking after critically sick patients. And the main worry for people being looked after in these settings is actually communication because they're so breathless. To have a mask that they can eat and drink through and talk is amazingly important for them. So in practical terms, that's one thing, but the other is just to have the information flowing to central hub, giving all the data that's necessary to show that they're going on a better journey than they were before.
Left off by saying that you're now trying to
Yeah.
develop a robot.
Yeah.
So please tell us about this robot that you're trying to develop.
Okay. So having mentioned a little bit about pulsing a small burst of nitric oxide with each breath, which worked very well and went into treating neonates with pulmonary hypertension. But when COVID came along, I joined a company to help them develop an oxygen delivery system. The elements of this I thought would be helped by pulsing gas. And they had a very good valve that opened the cylinder of gas to flow very quickly because I wanted it right at the beginning of the breath. And the importance of this is that the first bit of air that goes into your lung properly goes to just the right places for ventilation and enables the gas to quickly exchange with the blood. And that is a trick, a physiological trick. And it's simply because those parts of the lung have wide open airways and the alveoli open when you breathe. And if, for example, I stood on my head, it would be at the top of the chest here. Sitting here, it would go to the bases of your lung. And this is very important because in illness, when you have lots of your lung tissue taken out from its function, this gas that you breathe in at the beginning of the breath will be searching out those areas which are still well ventilated and perfused. So it's a trick to optimize the effectiveness of the inhaled gas. So we had to have this very quick valve, but I found that you didn't need a fast valve, but what you needed, and this is where a considerable amount of argument and discussion came, what you needed is to match the flow of the gas to the mouth to match the flow rate that you're breathing in. And this was in a whole series of papers suggesting that that would be a good idea. But nobody had actually studied it until a Dr. Lai studied it during COVID. And what he demonstrated is that people who had bad COVID could be breathing at the flow rate into the mouth at up to 40 liters per minute, or even higher. And yet the oxygen delivery that they were being given in the wards, easily or in the mask, was flowing at a maximum rate of 15 liters per minute. Okay, so considerably lower than the flow rate in. And what that meant is that the patient was breathing in largely air, that 25 liters extra flow rate were drawing in room air. not the oxygen. And the reason why it was at 15 litres per minute is that back in 1907, a man invented the rotameter, which is on the wall or on the cylinder, and you could turn the knob of it and the flow rate went up to 15 litres only. So these patients in the ward who were getting oxygen could never have more than 15 litres, no more. And yet some of them were breathing up to 40 or even 50 litres per minute. And therefore we're not getting the enrichment of the oxygen that they were there to breathe. So that started what I describe as a continuing piece of work, because our robot has to sense what the flow rate is and have something in their mouth measuring flow with a turbine in it or something of that sort, because we've got to deliver oxygen through it. So that's the trick. So we have tried a whole range of things and we're still looking for the ideal way of doing it, because I want to be able to puff a burst of oxygen at people's face, and I need it to go there and be caught in the stream of oxygen going into their mouth at 40 litres per minute or up to. If you're doing heavy exercise like an athlete, it goes up to essentially 300 litres per minute. You know, the Tour de France, when they're pedaling up the hill, it's going up to about 300 litres per minute. Now, I have to determine that flow rate right at the site of the mouth. And that's a trick. Now, I'm not going to tell you how I do it. But it is very, very difficult. And it's only over the last, let's say, the last months, I realized this. We've been doing exercise tests on people because that's a good way of testing what happens when you need oxygen. Because when you're pedaling, your oxygen need goes up and up and up and up and up. And with that, your ventilation rate goes up linearly with your oxygen need. But the minute ventilation, which we call that the ventilation rate, the minute ventilation rate, 3 times that value is a good estimate for the maximum flow rate that is needed at your mouth in the middle of the breath. So you could see in the normal exercise, you're perhaps going up to, I don't know, about, say, 30 litres per minute. You're going up to 90 litres per minute in terms of the maximum flow rate. So you can see there's a trick here, and the trick is to have the sensor as close as you can to the mouth. And when you start to exercise, you can talk and you're sort of happy and not really breathing very much because your brain is controlling your breathing. But as soon as the oxygen demand starts, your carotid bodies, little bodies that sieve out the corpuscles from the blood and just have the, if you like, the plasma of the blood, and your sensor that senses it's hypoxic coming straight from the lung, that'll tell you to breathe harder. And that overwhelms all the other controlling sets. So you become automatically driven to higher and higher flow rates. So that's the trick. And people will do that to extremists. And the element that we hope to do by increasing our delivery of oxygen to the fast ventilated parts of the lung, by matching the flow rate, we can probably get it up to the fraction inspired that we're actually delivering. So that means we could get up to 70 or 80 fraction inspired oxygen. And it makes a lot of difference then. And it could mean that people would not need to go on a ventilator. And what we found during COVID was that all the measures that people could have instead of going on a ventilator, things like CPAP, continuous positive pressure, airway pressure, treated for snoring, for example, or very high flow oxygen, continuous flow, which Lai used in his experiments, and non-invasive ventilation, which is a mask faced on, on your face. None of those methods lessened the frequency of having to use a ventilator, and they did not affect the mortality rate. And what we have to understand that COVID taught us that when people have pneumonia, they're really dangerously ill. And you've got to restore their oxygenation as quickly as possible. And using something that titrates the dose just to be the right dose for them to have enough oxygen. And that's why we do pulsing, because the robot will decide how much oxygen you get. And we have a machine in our robot which can go up to flow rates of 200 litres per minute. So we can select those very carefully with our way of sensing the flow. So that's where we are. And we, in 3 months' time, try out two very distinctly different ways of measuring flow in the start of the breath. And then we will do some exercises on lots of people, 100 or so, hopefully athletes, as well as people who are normal and fit, and those that are not so fit. And that'll give us a range of delivery speeds, if you like, for delivering the oxygen. So that's the background to ChemCon Robotics. And in practical terms, it grew from this earlier company that we worked with, and we've kept part of the name ChemCon, but called it robotics instead of medical. That's to acknowledge the insights that we got when we were working with them. So we have a machine that may well change how oxygen is delivered in hospitals and at home. And because it's robotic, it measures everything and it can transmit that information and communicate away from the patient in the ward. So you don't need to have people monitoring so closely. And that's terribly important in critical care units because the nursing staff, doctors as well, were crashing out because they were having to watch people so closely. Boris Johnson had something like 10 nurses looking after him when he went into Guy's St Thomas. And that kept him on a ventilator, and very importantly too. So I think the element here is it could change how we approach people who are in respiratory failure. And a nice little robot in a little box would do that.